Thanks for the introduction, Steve. Like you said, this is something that we wanted to do a number of years ago, just couldn't work out the timing when I was in town for business, but here we are and we're doing this, so that's great. So for tonight, I've decided to split things up into a few parts. So one is to give you some background on myself, how I got into the hobby, how I got into birding, as well as photography for that matter, and then spend some time on a few species that I've photographed more in depth here in Canada, although they're not necessarily exclusive to Canada. And then I'll take you through some more recent work that I've done mostly in the last year or slightly longer than that. There we go. So yeah, there's a picture of myself in my natural habitat, you could say. That was down in Florida a number of years ago with the scrub jays, always fun. I am from Toronto in Canada, so just to give you a sense of where that is geographically on the map, you might be surprised it's not as far north as some places in the States can be. I'm actually further south in the Pacific Northwest, for instance, living right in the middle of the Great Lakes there. We do have a fair bit of influence in terms of the birding, in terms of the weather and the climate, due to those lakes being so close, but that also gives us quite a variety of birds throughout the year in terms of migration paths and so on and so forth. So the way I got into this was in a bit of a roundabout way. So aviation for me is something that I've been interested in since really before my earliest memories. Apparently motion sickness was always a big problem for me when I was younger, and thankfully I've mostly grown out of that, but apparently that was something that always came up during flights, unfortunately. But it became something that I was very interested in as a young person. It was one of my primary hobbies, everything from keeping up to date on the industry through magazines and just, I think there were some collectible cards, things like that. I built plastic models that were available. I delved really heavily into flight simming. So that's essentially playing Microsoft Flight Simulator on the computer, and I tried to make it as realistic as possible, of course. Went to many air shows when I was very young. My parents would take me, and it was a highlight for me. And that all kind of went along incrementally, but what really really lit the spark for me even further was actually just a few weeks before 9/11. We were coming back from a family vacation, and I don't know how this all came about, but the pilots actually invited me up to the flight deck for landing. And of course, my parents said yes, and I was happy to do that. And that's really etched in my memory quite vividly, to say the least. Being in the flight deck just behind the pilot, strapped into the jump seat for landing. And that was, of course, like I said, just before 9/11. So that was unfortunately the end of that kind of opportunity, but that really lit the spark and took things further for me in the aviation and the flying area. At that time, I was starting to get into photography. I had an instant camera. It was the APS format, which I remember at the time I thought was very superior to 35mm because you could change the aspect ratio on it. But that was film. I had some years in the film world, but for the most part, I did skip it. I've been mostly a digital photographer, for better or for worse. And flying is something that came out of that jump seat experience. So I started flying lessons when I was in high school. I was able to actually fly solo on my own before I could even hold a driver's license. So I had to, funny enough, I had to drive to the airport. Either my parents would drive me, or at some point I was actually old enough to drive and have them as a passenger supervising. And then at the same time, I could go and take the plane solo and go flying, you know, with nobody else there. So that was quite ironic. And here I am on my first solo. I was 14 when I did that. And I'm not able to actually hold a license until 16. And in the meantime, I added more experience and night flying, cross country flying, and so on. and eventually ended up with a private pilot's license at 17. And there I am on one of my trips across southern Ontario. This was way back before selfies were a thing, and I was kind of just documenting the moment there. And back then, although this is only 15, 18 years ago, we were still taught right from the basics. We didn't have GPS. Everything was right to the fundamentals, visual navigation. You would work out your position relative to the plan and adjust your fuel and all those other variables accordingly. So very different than a digital flight deck would be perhaps now. And there's certainly a quote that has summarized things for me. It's attributed to Da Vinci, although there's some debate over who actually came up with this, but it certainly has held true for me, and I think for many others who've gone into aviation. And that's, once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward, for there you have been, and there you will always long to return. And I can certainly say that's very true with what has happened for myself in terms of aviation, in terms of birding that I eventually got into as well. Speaking of which, photography is something that became more interesting to me in a more serious way in the final year of high school. And this is something that I didn't really see until many years later, but I'm very much a visual person in terms of learning style and just how I take in information, but I also have a very strong analytical side to me. And photography is something that really fulfills both ends of that, and it gives I would say it's fulfilling from that perspective. It took me many years to realize this, but there are certainly ways that has become obvious. And flying was essentially parked at that point. Going into university, I simply didn't have the time to devote to that. There was nothing obvious to work towards. So in terms of photography, we had a Canon Rebel XT at the time as a family camera, some kit lenses. And really this all started off where I saw images online of wildlife, of birds, and I guess you could say I was inspired by it. In a way, I wanted to achieve the same thing for myself, not necessarily copy it, but that was a bit of a goal for myself. And we had a 75 to 300 kit lens there. And of course, birds are accessible. They're everywhere. You can find them almost anywhere. So that was a subject that I started with. And it was quite interesting that some of the skills that I had developed, particularly with plane identification, where I could look at something from a distance and pick it out by the silhouette and identify what aircraft it was, that carried over, paralleled very well in the birding world. And it worked on almost an intuitive basis, just as it had for plane identification. And ironically, now I live under the approach path to the Toronto airport. And just as I've come to identify birds by sound, I no longer really have to see the aircraft itself. I've grown used to the subtle differences in some of the engines, and I can almost always identify at least which family they're in just by the sound. So it's interesting how those parallels have developed. And for me, it was a source of stress relief. It was exercise. There are many benefits to getting out into nature, even though this is something that I had never really done in the past. I was never an outdoorsy type of person, but this was something that pushed me in that direction. And then shortly after we started my dad upgraded to the 100 to 400 L series lens, the very original, and that was a big move up in capability and in quality as well. And then later on, I also purchased the 1D Mark IIN at the time as it was, and a 500 f4, which then greatly opened things up. I was totally hooked and really convinced, I guess, that gear was the way to go, at least at the time. And I'll touch on that a little bit more. So throughout university, free time is a bit scarce, but any time that I did have, I would spend it on getting out, birding, taking photos, researching, just trying to learn more about it. This was an entirely new world to me. There was so much to learn, and that was something that really got me going. It was a motivation for me. And even back then, this would be 10, 15 years ago, it was pre-eBird, listservs were everywhere, but also printed book resources, and they were more frequently published than they are today, and have a whole bookshelf full of them, and relying on them to learn more about birds and plan trips and so on. And at the time, I would always chase the rarities. I would watch the birding reports, and I would go after what was reported, even though I didn't really understand why something was rare or desirable. I saw there was excitement over it. There was this, I guess you could say, scarcity and rare factor, and I would go after those. And in a way, I'm happy I did. There were many opportunities I had, which I really haven't had since. We had the white-winged crossbill invasion about 12 years ago, and we really haven't seen too many since, haven't had any great opportunities. So I'm quite happy I did chase some of those, even though I didn't fully understand the context or the background of these, or knew much about the species to begin with. And one really big pivot for me was going on a bird workshop, specifically for warblers, with Matthew Studebaker in 2008. And I think that's probably a common theme for some of you, perhaps. I know many people in the birding world have gone out with him for photos. And this really marked a complete change in my photography. I had no sense of what a setup was, or how to do that, or that this was even a possibility, let alone things like some of the other techniques, playback and use of feeders and so on. And that really just opened my eyes to what was possible, and really changed how I approach birding. So as I said, I've always been a bit more of a techie, gearhead person. I went to university for engineering, so it's somewhat appropriate. And certainly for many years, I thought that having the best gear was the way to go. So I eventually upgraded from the 500 to a 600 and then an 800. And then now I've been on the 600 for a good decade, and I'm quite happy with that. But I was always chasing focal length and lower weight and all these advantages. But I really didn't have that much of an understanding of some of the artistic concepts behind what a good photo is, and ornithology itself. So everything from bird behavior to habitat and so on. There are many gaps in those areas over the years. And during university, I primarily chased species, again, not so much the rarities, but just trying to build out a portfolio. But I also found that this was something that became less fulfilling, simply ticking things off a checklist. And you have a photo, you have a portrait of them on a perch, and now you move on to the next species. That wasn't quite doing it for me. And by the time I graduated, I had a pretty good portfolio of some of the local birds and also the broader northeastern area birds. And then I did a 1-month road trip to Florida after graduation by myself, which was really a big leap for me. I had never done anything more than, say, a weekend or perhaps a week away until then. And here I was going away for a month. I was sleeping in the car at times, covering a lot of ground, and quite a few different habitats and species. And I was able to make some stops along the way for warblers as they were coming north in spring, and picked up quite a good portfolio during that trip. So that was a big milestone for me. Next in my birding journey is BC, and this is on the west coast of Canada. If you're not familiar with it, it's a huge, huge province. Just to get a sense of it, I looked it up. It's somewhere around 1/3 larger than Texas, so it's absolutely huge. They have so many different types of habitats and terrain there. It's everything from desert to rainforest and literally everything in between. They don't have tundra or Arctic habitat, but they have just about everything else. And I have not explored really anything more outside of the bottom third, the southern third of the province. I've only been in the north a few times, so there's so much there that I simply haven't gotten to. Now, the reason for that is I took on an IT consultant, or also a bit of project management was involved, the role after grad. And we had many customers in BC, and I had the opportunity to go, and I kind of became hooked. I requested to work out there on projects whenever possible. I was out there 1 or 2 times a month, typically, And just going through some of my notes here, just to get a sense of an estimate from 2012 up until the pandemic. So yeah, it was a good 7 years, 8 years. I probably did 75 or so round trips, or even more, to BC. And through my work travel, through my personal travel, I was gone somewhere around one night in every 3 or so annually, which was fine by me. Certainly, it's been an adjustment to just being home most of the time now, but I had a lot of opportunities there. And this is where I met Luis as well. So we had several Bay Area conferences or events over the years, and I got in touch with him. I was looking for things to shoot. I was looking for some direction there. We met up a few times as well and did some shooting together, and that went on to doing some trips as well. We went to Alaska, as Steve said. We also went to Florida, Ohio, possibly something else that I'm forgetting, but we've been around, we've done quite a bit together, and we stay in touch quite closely. And I also, during this time, I did many of my own trips as well. Texas, Florida, the East Coast, many spots throughout Canada, other trips to Alaska as well. But more importantly for me, what happened in this 7 or 8 year period is that I became much more well-versed in nature and ornithology, whether that was recognizing habitat much more readily and knowing what to find there, and bird behaviors and how to perhaps use that to my advantage. But a huge leap forward in terms of call recognition as well. And I have been published quite a few times over the years. I don't really keep too much track of it, and I don't have all the examples here, but here are a few that I had on hand. Not something that I really seek out. It's just happened. I don't really market myself. I find that quite unnatural, but I do post now and then, and this just came from people finding my photos for the most part. So moving on to some of the species that I'd like to focus on. One is the redneck grebe, and it's found really in a broad area of Canada. So typically the prairies and parts of BC, that's really the main habitat for them. But where I've photographed them is down in Toronto and along the lakeshore there. So this is really quite an interesting development where 10, 15 years ago, they were not nesting here at all, but they do migrate through here, and I guess people realized that they were sticking around, they were trying to nest, and eventually nest platforms were put out for them. And that was initially just a basic tire, just anchored down. They now have more proper nest boxes as well, or platforms, I should say. And the numbers, they just increased. They've exploded in the last 10 years. They're all over the lakeshore of Lake Ontario, around Toronto. The mating scenes, the dances, and the calling is just everywhere, prevalent in April. Very popular with photographers to get that sequence of photos as well. And the one disadvantage to the nest boxes or the platforms is, of course, that they're not very photogenic. So this particular photo here I took out in Calgary, so out in the prairies. That was a fully natural nest. Nothing like that is really possible in Toronto, but I was so happy to at least have that opportunity. The chicks were probably less than a week old, and just at that perfect point, the little zebra faces poking out. And then in Toronto, there's been some really good opportunities too, just not so much on the nest. So these guys, I couldn't believe that they all piled onto there and didn't sink mom, but they managed, and they're paddling around, and the dad is coming and feeding them, and this was quite an experience to have. And this was also, this nest here, the second one, was from same time of year, similar area, just a different nest. I've never seen 5 chicks before or since. That was really an exceptional number. Normally it's 2, 3, sometimes 4, but that's about the maximum. So this was quite something. And I was just really happy to get them all looking more or less in my direction just in the last few minutes of light. It is pretty tricky to try to coordinate all of them, but it worked out really nicely here. And I think this is probably the same family, maybe just the one is hiding. But yeah, just giving me that cute pose, little zebra faces poking out, almost like a little snorkel in a way. So I shot most of these primarily from land. It is possible to get lower along the lakeshore in some of the areas. It is a little bit tricky because it does get deep quite quickly. So when you're working with a big lens, these were typically with the 600 and extenders. It is a little bit tricky. You're contorted in a kind of a downhill position while you've got this big lens trying to get the photo. However, this past year, this last summer, I did get in the water with waders with a few guys locally. And I was really happy to have this opportunity. This is an area that I think they've nested in before, but it's kind of tucked away and people don't really know about it. And it is a little bit sketchy because it does get deep quickly, but you can go out just a little ways and get a much better angle. And we used flash because there are condo buildings close by and they cast quite a shadow in the evening. And it was kind of yucky at times. And this certainly is something that goes hand in hand with bird photography. It's something I've grown used to. And they only had one chick. And I'm not sure if something happened to the other one, but regardless, there's some great opportunities there. Even if it was just the one chick with riding around with mom, of course, always giving some great poses. And the dad would do all the fishing. So he's a little bit brighter in plumage yet, especially at this time of year. He has a bit more of an eye ring. That's one way to tell them apart. And he did all the fishing while mom took care of the chick. And the handoff shot, this is one of the hardest photos. I have very few that I'm happy with, just trying to get all the depth of field lined up. It's just so hard to get that with a long lens, and this was one of the better ones. And then of course to get them all looking in an ideal direction, it's just hard. You need lots of opportunities to get a shot that you're happy with. And then there was one evening where they brought in this huge crayfish, and I think they misjudged what this little chick was actually capable of eating. It was one of those times where I wish I could take video and photos at the same time, because this went on for at least 10 minutes and he's struggling with this crayfish, just trying to get it down. And you know, he would drop it, mom would go grab it and encourage him, try to coax him to eat this thing. And I was really quite happy with the sequence of photos too, getting the adults in there, and it's not just a kind of a clinical clean shot of the chick on his own. And I mean, this, like I said, this went on for at least 10 minutes. He's trying to get this thing down, repositioning it over and over. And I think this was just before he got it down, and now he's repositioned it so the head is sticking out, but he did manage to get it down eventually. And then they were also doing a little bit of mating activity or nest building. It seemed that they wanted to, I don't know, build a nest, refurbish it, or have another batch, but it was nearly August at this time. Actually, things were very delayed. We had high water this year, and the nest kept washing out, and they kept relaying eggs and trying to keep their nest afloat. But eventually they did have this chick, but that was kind of late into July. And I don't believe they nested with another batch. That would have been way too late for them. Typically June is when they would hatch, or even late into May. Next on the list is a great gray owl, which, you know, certainly not exclusive to Canada. It is something that I've done more work with in Canada. They have a very, very broad range, but of course they're very difficult to actually find, even though they are more common than I think anybody realizes. And they are very much a hot commodity for photographers and for social media. So that does sometimes lead to some complications as well. So I've circled the broader range of where they are, more the boreal forests in Canada. They do come down to the Ottawa, Montreal area almost every year in winter. It could just be a bird or two birds, not too many. They do say there's this 4-year eruption cycle. We haven't been totally sticking to that, but some years there are definitely more, and they're more prevalent and they come further south. So for the most part, my photography has been in that area. It's also been in the interior of BC and in the foothills just west of Calgary leading into the Rockies. So this particular one was done many years ago in Ottawa. It was challenging shooting, to say the least. It was absolutely perfect in terms of what I would want for a photo of a great gray, though. I think I was shooting the 1D Mark III at the time, and it was like literally one in every couple shots was actually focused. It was struggling so hard with the snow. Would certainly love an opportunity to redo this with modern equipment, but one of those great memories that I have of trips in the past. And this one was also done in Ottawa. It was a number of years later. Just a phenomenal morning. Started to snow heavily, and this was not a setup or anything like that. He was just hunting at the edge of the forest. The perch just happened to be there, and could not ask for anything better. This was definitely one of my favorite images, just the way everything came into place here. And of course, when you have a cooperative bird, doing portraits is always an option. This was done outside of Calgary, west of Calgary a ways, sitting on a fence post. Of course, that doesn't make for the greatest of photos. So I was in the car and put the extender on, and of course the bird is totally accepting of you, and there you go. You have a portrait. It doesn't take too much more than that. This one was done in BC. One of the adults hunting early in the morning. It was a little bit underexposed at the time, but I went with it. I really like the moodiness of it rather than trying to correct it for what might be a properly balanced exposure. You have, the Phantom of the North, as they say, coming out of the shadows. And I was quite happy with this one and some of the others I got on that trip. There were multiple nests in the area. Like I said, they're much more common than people realize. And, I had two families within, I'm going to say, less than a kilometer of each other. The one I found almost by accident. I think I saw some feathers on the ground walking through the forest, and then I happened to see one of them just flying out of the corner of my eye. It was a total fluke. And even with that, their calls during the females' begging calls in particular at this time of year, they do carry quite a ways. So that was another method for zeroing in on them. And I was kind of at the top of a hill looking down on them, and I was therefore able to get this photo of one of the parents coming in with prey to feed the chicks. Otherwise, the angles wouldn't have worked if we were on level ground because the chicks were so far up into the tree. And the handoff shots were always tricky. It was hard to get a really ideal setting for that. This was one of the better ones. But certainly a challenge with light and shooting against the sky, perhaps, but still pretty happy with the opportunity I had here. And like I said, there were a few families. This one had two chicks, and this is actually a video which I tried with Steve, and it seemed to work. If your internet connection isn't great, it may not translate so well on your side, but we'll give this a go. And these two were quite the characters. They were all over each other, and just amazingly alert. They knew I was there. They were hypersensitive to anything going on, just like he seemed shocked about his siblings' wingspan. But at the same time, they were totally accepting of me, and that was really cool just to have them accept me. The parents would come in. They really didn't care that I was there unless, I made a sound, and they would look around. Okay, so that was a clip I had, and then here are the two later on. I was really happy to get them together like that. again, it's one of those things, do you take video, do you take photos? I wish I could do both at the same time sometimes. So I was kind of switching back and forth depending on what they were doing. And of course, they're getting their sense of balance and starting to branch out and becoming more mobile, although they certainly can't fly at this point. And here he was just catching himself from slipping off this branch. It was quite a moment there. And last year I was there as well, and I typically prefer to be there in overcast light simply because it's so much easier to shoot in the forest. You're not dealing with all the shadows and the light and so on, the bright spots. But I kept an open mind. I went there even though it was sunny, and everything just worked out amazingly here at sunset, where suddenly the female took off and just flew right in front of me. It was backlit, but lit up those feathers beautifully. You can see that whole feather structure there, and the backgrounds is one picture I'm quite pleased with, just the way it worked out. It's not something I would have necessarily thought of as an ideal scenario, but you have to keep an open mind and just go with it sometimes, and you can be quite surprised and pleased with what you get. And then likewise, she would just sit there, and I took a variety of poses, just kind of backlit, no dramatic action or anything, but there's that moodiness, there's that working with the light rather than just trying for some flat overcast light, which is something that I've tried to improve, because I'm one of those people that like to go out on overcast days only if I can help it, and there is definitely a case to be made for working with all kinds of light. So I have many other photos, but in the interest of, for the sakes of this presentation, I'm going to move on to the northern Pygmy Owl, which is also quite specialized to BC. You can find it in some areas of Alberta. You can, of course, find it further south into the States. They are very common on Vancouver Island, especially in clear cuts where logging has happened on slopes. They really like that kind of habitat. But they are incredibly inconspicuous and overlooked. When I saw my first one a few years ago, I was totally shocked, because I've probably gone past so many of them and I just had no idea that they were there. So they really do like the very tippy tops of trees, whether that's 100 feet up, or sometimes you get lucky and they're down low on a smaller tree or perch. This was really quite ideal. This was on a slope in a clear cut, just like I said, but there weren't too many taller trees around. So he was perched on some of the newer growth that was a little bit lower. And if you stand uphill, you're shooting downhill, you can get great angles without having to work too hard or shooting up against the sky for that matter. And yeah, like I said, just to give you a sense of scale, there he is relative to some of these needles. Just kind of like a little ornament on top of the Christmas tree, you could say. And of course, they're pretty fierce little guys. I do have a video clip right after this to show you. And so it's amazing here to me how alert they are, and I'll get started. But they also have this kind of gimbal effect where they can keep their head, it seems like, in the exact same position, so that their gaze is always fixed in one spot for hunting purposes. Which you see some of that here, just as he's pivoting around, his body is literally just pivoting right around his head. And yeah, just incredibly alert, every little thing he's looking around at, and he's got those fake eyes, the feathers on the back of the head to confuse the birds. That was also pretty neat for me to see. Just incredibly fierce for their size. They're just tiny. Okay. And so there's, yeah, a photo of some of those feathers at the back of the head. They certainly confused me a few times as well, just looking at them from a distance. And here are some of my more favorite photos of this guy on some cedar perches. They're quite appropriate just for his size. It's sometimes difficult to get a perch that is sized appropriately for such a small bird, but there were a few opportunities for that. Also on some planer perches, and then I got a number of them with him on this mossy log just as he was hunting around this clearing. I was really happy that he eventually did go for that. Spent a couple days here, a few different sessions. And next on my list is the black tern. So this is a bird that you can definitely find in the States as well. They're very common throughout the prairies for us in that kind of habitat. But again, I photographed them just like the grebes. I photographed them in a place that wasn't all that common, and that was at Point Pelee National Park, which is really almost the very southernmost point of Ontario and of Canada for that matter. That's highlighted there at the bottom. And they have a boardwalk there that goes through their marsh there. And this does not work out every year by any means, so I wouldn't necessarily plan on coming here and being able to get photos every year, but it has worked out every odd year. And their nests are accessible thanks to this boardwalk. You could also take a canoe out there, although that becomes a little bit harder to take photos from. But they're very, very vulnerable to water levels and to storms and from the wind that can come out of those. So there have been many nests that I've heard about and I've gone down because things are supposed to be good, only to find out, oh, it's been washed out or things have changed. It's very much something that you just have to go and make the most of it. So you can, there's a few habits that they have that you can exploit. So if you walk up to them along the boardwalk, they'll hover first above their nest, above their chicks, just to assess the situation, assess you and how close you are, and you can use that to your advantage, get some photos of them up against the sky. I'd love to get them against some kind of dramatic light, some darker clouds, but I was happy to get some of these photos. These are all just with the 100 to 500, actually. That's how close I was in this case. But what they will typically then do is they will dive bomb you. And they did make contact with a few people that were coming along the boardwalk. So you do have to be a little bit cautious, I guess, or aware of what's going on. They do come awfully close. And what I found is that if you sit down and you get below the railing level, you get down nice and low, they actually accept you really, really quickly. That was really cool because, you know, within a few minutes, they were perching just 10 feet away from me, which is not something that you would expect at all. And the adults, they also lose their plumage pretty rapidly into late June, which is just as the chicks are really hatching and being fed. So it's a bit of a balancing act, trying to have everything line up. These are all photos from this past summer. This one I got just in the very, very last minutes of light. I was really happy with how that one turned out. And mayflies, yeah, let me tell you about mayflies. So mayflies, I had no real awareness of the hatching patterns of them. So they hatch, they're in the mud, they're in Lake Erie, and they hatch and they live for a couple days. And I walked out of the hotel this one morning to find this, which was a total shock to me. So apparently they come out overnight. Typically they're attracted to light or white or bright objects as well as to lights. So that's why they're all over this person's car. I would hate to try to get in there. And I also found them along the hotel. There's a whole bunch of carcasses from the ones that have already died. And then of course, all the light posts in town were just covered. Something just totally wild for me to see because I had no understanding of this or realized that it would be to this extent. And of course, those are then prey, food for the chicks. So the parents will bring in mayflies when they're small, of course. This was actually taken with a 100 to 500 as well, just off the boardwalk. That area there is basically the nest, so you can see why they're vulnerable to any kind of weather. There's really no protection for them at all. And they would also feed them dragonflies. Dragonflies definitely, I think, is a little more dependent on the weather. Once it gets a little bit hotter, a little bit later, the chicks are a little bit bigger. They will then bring in dragonflies as well. Fish is also on the menu. This one, the parent kind of misjudged the size. I think it actually ended up eating it itself, but typically the fish were much smaller that they would give to the chicks. That's kind of more of a last phase, I would say. As they grow larger, then the diet starts to transition as well. And these guys were, yeah, they're awfully cute, just up to their little antics and staying close to each other. And also staying really close to mom. So even though it wasn't cold by any means, 15 to 20 Celsius maybe, they did need to be kept warm. So they would huddle close to mom. She would actually go cover them, and I guess it's not really incubating per se, but to keep them warm. They would sleep for a while. She would warm them up, and then it was time to be fed, or maybe force fed, if you will. And this is just a cycle that went on and on throughout the day, just feeding, sleeping, just constant. It was amazing how quickly they grew too. I went back less than a week later, and the size difference was quite something. So again, another video. I did this one in slow motion. It's about 1/4 speed now, so shot in 120 FPS, brought back to 30. Things just happened way too quickly to do this in regular speed. So here are a few feeding sequences. And again, something that I wish I could take photos simultaneously, but was happy to have some of these videos. They do sometimes tell a little bit more of the story than just a single photo. And this chick here is quite a bit older at this point. Yeah, he does manage to get this one down. It was a bit of a challenge, but managed to swallow the dragonfly whole. And the two chicks, they would often compete for food. And it seemed like the one that would display or beg the most would tend to get the food. The one that was the most aggressive, although I'm not really sure what the parents are thinking when they allocate the food, but it seemed like one was larger and he would tend to get most of the food, just because he would call the most, and he would be up in their face begging more. Yeah, and this fish he actually did manage to get down. I was really surprised, but I guess they are pretty hungry. And I had some other footage as well. Maybe at some point, if I go back, I'll maybe have a mini documentary if I focus on some of the video aspects further. So continuing on, those are the species that I wanted to show you. In terms of my own personal direction with photography, I would say in the last couple of years, I've become much more of a generalist. So I've really expanded into landscape and wildlife. Part of it is because I simply have photographed so many species. I like to do something new, and it's sometimes hard to improve on what you've done or try to do something different. And it's something that I would encourage anyone looking to improve their photography, is to try a different genre of photography. So with landscape photography, the composition and the light is so much more critical. If you're working with a wide angle lens, you move it just a little bit, suddenly you have a totally different perspective on things. And I found that has actually been very, very helpful in my own bird photography, because I'm seeing things from a different angle. I'm taking all these other variables into consideration in a way that I really hadn't done before. So it's been very beneficial to me, just even for my own bird photography. And especially with landscape photography, post-processing is such a make or break with it. I don't really like the style where people post-process things to look more ethereal or arts, like a painting sort of. But there is a lot that goes into it, and there are techniques there as well that can be applied elsewhere. I've also really gotten into backpacking and getting out into the backcountry, primarily for landscape and these other opportunities. But it's been great. It's resulted in more fitness for me, and really getting out of my comfort zone. I used to always stay in a hotel, and for the last couple of years, it's not so much the hotel, it's sleeping in the back of the rental vehicle or in a tent somewhere. It's quite a bit different, and I've kind of embraced it and moved out of that comfort zone. There have also been many changes. Social media, for better or for worse, the crowds that it has brought to some of these hotspots, it's not really my thing. And the number of people out there as opposed to getting away by yourself and having a, a stress-free shoot. But yeah, we'll leave it at that. And of course, some of the, hotspots change. I think we've all seen that there's reduced access, or access is eliminated perhaps, or the bird habits or the numbers simply aren't the same over time either. And even for myself, I mean, I started more or less with digital for bird photography, at least, and the advancements are incredible. I couldn't imagine having done bird photography with film and then looking at where the industry is now with what you can do with software, with all the technology that mirrorless and focusing systems that have come out. Would have loved to have had those in previous trips or opportunities that I had. That is what it is, of course. And I've always been someone that has been focused on getting things right in camera, which I think is still very valid and it is beneficial, but it's not nearly as critical with all the tools that are available today. And processing is something that I've never really gotten along with. Just, I guess you could say, the tedious nature of it, and just culling images, picking images, let alone going through them and processing them. It's perfectionism for sure, and it's a bit of a barrier just to sit down and go through that. So I'm so hopelessly far behind. I don't know, maybe I'll be processing when I'm retired and finally catch up. So I have not typically posted in a long time. I tend to focus all my efforts and my free time. Seems like the older you get, the free time is more limited on actually getting out and shooting. So I'm years and years behind, for better or for worse. And so just to illustrate some of the images that have come along the way in the last couple of years, these are just a few of the images that have really changed my direction, I guess you could say. So these are images that gave me a glimpse of what I could do differently and how I could change my own photography. So, this is a great horned owl nest. You go there in the middle of the day, it's, it's just a documentary photo. There's nothing special about it per se. But I was here really kind of right at sunset. It was drizzling. I actually had to catch a flight, had to leave soon. And as soon as I took this photo, I knew I had something really special here. Not only did I have the chicks looking out, I had, of course, the mom in the back just peering out, that watchful yellow eye. There was a lot of mood to this. It wasn't just a standard bird on a perch or a documentary photo. And of course, I've processed it a little bit. I've lifted things up. It's not quite as flat as it was in the initial photo. But this is something that really got me thinking about approaching photography from kind of a different angle or a different perspective, or looking for different things. Rather than what I had been doing for so many years, I've simply been following the rules, you could say. And what is a perfect rule of thirds composition and the perfect bird pose, and it's all front lit and on it goes. Whereas that was usually my filter, and this was a step to challenging some of those conceptions. This was another one that stood out for me. So typically in the past, I would be looking for a single bird, a nice clean shot, a clean background. And this flock was out in Stanley Park in Vancouver, and immediately something clicked for me. I thought, okay, this is really cool. I need to work this opportunity and take a number of photos from all sorts of perspectives. And definitely among one of my more favorite photos. It is abstract. It may not work for everyone. Everyone has their own preference, and it's not perfectly symmetrical either, but I think that gives it more interest. So again, that was something that came up a number of years ago and had me thinking, had me reevaluating what I was considering as an ideal or a model photo. And this was another one where I was just driving along, just kind of the fog was in the valley just after sunrise. It was a sunny day, so I didn't expect to get much, but I thought I'd go out anyway. It was the end of my trip, and came around the corner and I saw this. Thought, okay, that's really cool. I had no idea the ravens were there. They're on the left side, and so I pulled over, took the photo, and took a few photos. Of course, this was with the 100 to 400, and among my most favorite photos, it's a birdscape or a landscape, whatever you want to call it. I could have taken out the 600, put some teleconverters on it, and try to just get the ravens, but that would have missed the point entirely. And again, it was something that really got me thinking about, it was a sunny day. I could have just said, no, I'm not going to get anything. I could have not gone out at all. But sometimes there's opportunity where you least expect it. And, also another thing that has come up is where I think I'll go back to a place and I'll do better at something and there'll be better opportunities. And that often is not the case. So even in this particular location, the bank that I was standing on at the side of the road is more or less eroded. I don't think you could safely stand there anymore unless you wanted to risk falling down hundreds of feet into the valley here. So this opportunity is probably not there anymore for the foreseeable future unless they come in and they stabilize the bank or they do something like that. Otherwise, you're literally standing on the road, and it's a very sketchy position to be in at this particular spot. So with that being said, I do want to close out with some recent work. This is mostly from the last year and a bit. So as I mentioned, I've really had a perspective shift, and it's about defining more of a personal vision and artistic focus. And that's very, very vague, even for myself. I don't think I can tell you what that is, but I certainly know what I do like or things that I gravitate to. And like I said, I've spent so many years simply documenting, focusing on the rules, and now I'm kind of challenging the rules. They don't always apply, or at least not all of them. One other thing there is really just working with common species, going out and trying to gain new perspectives on birds that you just overlook. You see them every day, you don't think much of them, you don't spend much time even trying to photograph them. And then there's also the light. So like I mentioned, I used to be a guy who would only go out on cloudy days. That was really just my default type of light, unless I was doing something with water in the frame. Typically those photos do better with sun. But there's definitely opportunity there, and I'll show you some examples there. And I think really importantly for myself is that I go out and I photograph what I like, what I feel like doing on my own terms. I'm not chasing species. I'm not following people on social media, going from one thing to the next, or what the latest trend is, or even with rarities or rare birds, just doing my own thing, keeping it open-ended, not feeling that I'm constrained or, following the herd, if you will. And hand in hand with that is just competing with myself, trying to do better versus what I have, rather than looking at what other people are doing, trying to outdo them or compete with them. That is something that's very easy to fall into, and that's something that I've definitely had to challenge myself on, to see things in a different way. And of course, the perfectionism goes into that as well. Like I said, you can't come back and do a return trip that's better. Things change, and I've learned this lesson many times. Unfortunately, you have to really make the most of what you've been given. One other thing that I found too is I really do enjoy abstract photos and also telephoto landscapes. Somehow it really gets me going visually. So that's something I've paid attention to. That's something I try to focus on, just in terms of a genre of landscape photography, for instance. And I think part of that is I've just seen the world in a telephoto way for so many years. When I'm out with a camera birding for the better part of the decade, I'm at 400, 500, 600, 1200 millimeters. I'm not looking at it from a wide angle perspective. So working with something like a 16 to 35 is very challenging for me. And that's an area that I really do want to improve in as well. So just to give you a sense of that, when I talk about common species, I did have some inspiration for these photos from other photos that I've seen. This is something I went out this spring on some really cold, clear mornings that we had, just to get some photos of red-winged blackbirds. I had no real plan of what I was looking for. I just went out and I thought I'd see what I would get. And, this was not a setup. There was nothing here at all. He was just there performing, and I'm just taking photos. And this is something that's only there for a short period of time. You can't improve on it. You have to make the most of it. It was really only that day because it was well below zero. We had the condensation from his breath, and even it was really just the first 30 minutes or so of light. After that, it warmed up and you didn't have that backlit effect, and the moment was gone. And again, it just really reinforces that you have to make the most of what you have on hand. Interestingly enough, this is just to expand a little bit. This is not something I would have ever done in years past. A backlit photo is not something I would have immediately thought of trying. Always try for front lit or at least side lit, and more of a silhouette. Again, not something that I would have thought of trying. And interestingly enough, there were dozens of photographers there. They all literally walked by. Nobody was interested in this. Not trying to brag about that, but it's about seeing really the beauty in all of these situations that you might overlook. And certainly in years past, I might have just walked past this type of scene as well. And yeah, so I did a variety of compositions there. You can also, of course, you can process this lighter or darker depending on your preference. You can have more of a full silhouette versus having some of the color in the wings. And while I was there, I happened to notice, well, it's been cold, the water has iced over. And again, in years past, I would have never thought about this at all, but I just went nuts. This was something that really, like I said, it turned me on visually. I took all kinds of photos, abstract photos of the ice along the shoreline there, and I felt I came away with a lot, even though this was something totally unplanned and spontaneous. I then went back to that location about a week later, and the ice is gone, but we had some egrets that were migrating through. And again, this is not something I would have shot in previous years. They were deep in the shade and the shadows. Exposing for the highlights would basically crush the blacks. And technically, maybe it's not perfect. It's not something that I would have looked at. And interestingly enough, too, all the other photographers there, they seemed to be waiting for them to come out into actual direct light. But I was really quite pleased with some of the more abstract photos I got. There were 2 or 3 of them, and they had all kinds of poses next to each other, or just individual birds. I just have the one, but there's all sorts of compositions that they gave me that may not be everybody's cup of tea, but for me, this really does quite a bit for me. And I turned around from taking this photo, and there you had the really low light just over the hill, lighting up these small leaves on the tree. This was early in the spring, which I liked. It was, it's one of these moments that was over within 5 or 10 minutes. And, it's really that subtlety. There's just that quiet, subtle beauty there. And I don't know if you can see it on your end, but there are also tree trunks, just very kind of in the shadows, just poking out, which really ground the image and give it some depth for me as well, and just help out the composition. And I think this is the last landscape photo. I will get back to a few bird photos. I went out to a sunflower field, a farm. This is something that would have been totally out of my consideration, out of my comfort zone. Nothing I would have ever thought about in years past, but wanted to get something different, wanted to push myself. And there were a few photos I was quite happy with, just those very last moments of light, just working with the light. Again, not going out on a cloudy day, but trying to make the most of the light and using it to actually enhance the image in this case. I did do some traditional bird photography this year as well. I was really fortunate with this pileated woodpecker nest, and I got all kinds of photos of the feeding of the youngsters. They have so much attitude and character. It was it was a lot of fun seeing them. I took a bunch of video as well, just of them going at it, interacting with each other, being fed. And also in terms of capabilities, so this was taken with the 2x converter on the 600, and with the R5, I actually had enough resolution I could crop down, and this is still something like 10 or 15 megapixels, wherein with previous cameras, it would have been far, far less, and something that I might have kept, but it wouldn't have been all that useful for publication or for printing something. So continuing that thought, I also did a lot with the R5 this year, and just taking advantage of those mirrorless capabilities, some of the advanced focusing compared to previous cameras, taking photos of swallows in particular. These are spots that I've been to many times over the years, and I've had really just the odd sharp image, and all of those images, by the time you crop them, they were almost unusable. So sure, the R5 could use some improvements, stacked sensor and so on, but it finally opens up all of these opportunities as something that's actually viable, and you can walk away with dozens of keepers from a session if everything goes well. So ditto for the barn swallows. I was able to get them kind of early, just as they were nest building and before their plumage got too ratty from going in and out of the nest and turns and various other things. It was quite a productive spring for me this year, even if it was all local shooting. And yeah, so continuing that theme, this was out by the Great Grays. It was a cold night, mist on the water, the sun was coming up. And there were other photographers there. They were going for the Great Grays. So I was pulled over. They had no interest in this. I had noticed this happening one day and I took some photos and I came back the next day, just the perfect set of conditions, really cold, below zero overnight, sunny the next day. And, you know, like I said, this is something that was here and there, here and gone so quickly. It was maybe like a 20-minute window before the sun rose too high and then the backlighting and the mist disappeared. So I got a bunch of actual bird landscape photos, whatever you want to call them, that I was really happy with. They're just really peaceful moments. You know, it's just quiet, subtle light. It's nothing flashy. There's no action here. Again, this is something that really pushed me out of my comfort zone, but also got me thinking about possibilities for what I could do. And yeah, so these photos were really, they're not really edited. It was really quite this dramatic in lighting and that backlit effect. And again, more of a pure landscape photo here. And this past fall, I was in Jasper. I was taking photos of the sunrise, I guess it was. And what do you know, there's a loon there. So, you know, quickly put on a longer lens and here we have some more birdscape opportunities. So it's something that I do like doing when I have the opportunity. To me, it's far more interesting than if I try to just isolate the loon and have the loon filling the frame or being the primary focal point. As part of this trip, I was also on Vancouver Island, and again, this is something I would have never done in the past. I spent an entire morning just taking photos of backlit bears, which to me, I would have never seen the point to this before. I would have always tried to be on the frontlit side, but really happy with how some of these turned out. I have all sorts of other ones with different compositions where I incorporated the rocks and some of the reflections in the water as well. But really goes to show, you know, you have to make the most of it, see things in a different way, and use the light to your advantage. So this is, again, this is a spot that I would typically only go to in cloudy weather. But when it dawned clear, I thought, why not? Let's go for it and see what you can do. Think out of the box. I also did some backpacking just about 2 months ago in BC, going for mountain goats. And I took a lot of more traditional photos, more habitat photos like this, but also took advantage of the light. So this is, you know, again, I would have preferred to have cloud, but I was really happy with how this particular one turned out, just kind of spotlit. The sun was at the right angle and really does a lot for the photo, as opposed to having this in flat light where the whole foreground would be properly lit and not in shade. So this was another example of that. In terms of abstract photos, this may or may not do anything for everybody, but kind of a hieroglyphic shadow of mountain goat on the rocks there. And again, just exploiting the light to your advantage, taking advantage of backlit, which is something that I typically wouldn't do. It is also a lot easier with mirrorless. You have that live exposure and you can use that to your advantage to meter more accurately as things happen. And also playing around with focal length, trying to go wider as opposed to always portraits or shooting with a long lens, although that can certainly work out to your advantage as well, especially when the light is just so perfect for the position of that animal in this case. So that is all I have. Thank you all for coming and your time tonight.